While the murder of Willie Moretti certainly grabbed headlines, the powers that be had bigger things on their plate and an even more dubious use for organized crime. At the same time, the US government was getting deeply entangled in the Korean War, among other global conflicts, and they found themselves leaning heavily on organized crime. In an astonishing twist, this was the first time the CIA would collaborate with these underworld figures, venturing into the narcotics trade to funnel weapons and funds into shadow wars. They did this with the explicit permission of President Harry Truman. By channeling money through these illicit networks, the government kept these covert operations hidden from the press and the American public. No paper trail, no accountability, just layers of secrecy. It would take decades for the full story to emerge, but the bond between organized crime and the CIA was cemented during this era. As Luciano himself put it, once the Korean War escalated, the legal pressure and issues I had to deal with were cut in half. The same government that once hounded him now turned a blind eye to many of his activities. This didn't mean Luciano's problems disappeared, but suddenly he had a level of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. The war on organized crime, intense as it was, seemed to favor the mafia in the end. The top brass in the mob remained untouched, no asset seizures, no deportations, and no arrests. While a few figures took a hit, the real power players emerged unscathed. Meanwhile, Luciano, ever the opportunist, had his eyes set on new horizons. His legal troubles with the Italian authorities were a constant annoyance. Yet in October 1951, they handed him a passport, just like that. Italy seemed to have its own agenda, perhaps trying to stick the needle into Uncle Sam over American demands for military spending. Regardless, Luciano suddenly had the freedom to travel to countries like France, Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, and England. Luciano didn't waste time. He used the passport to meet his old friend, Meyer Lansky, in London. As he reflected on this unexpected gift, "I didn't ask for it at the time and I didn't pay to get it, but a guy from the caserna across the street quickly visits and asks if I'd like my passport back. I told him, 'Sure, you bet.'" Italy's political games had given Luciano a golden ticket. Charlie, now free to roam Europe, visited London, Paris, Zurich, and beyond. "I never used the visas for Belgium or Spain," he admitted, but he spent time in Switzerland to check on a nest egg Lansky had set up for him in Zurich. Although the account wasn't vast, maybe a couple 100,000, it was enough for Luciano to ensure his future. Luciano's newfound freedom wasn't just about business. He indulged in the luxuries of Europe, attending races in Paris, gambling in secluded spots, and exploring the sights. He reveled in these experiences, even if they were brief. "Another time I went up to see the races at Longchamps, outside Paris. Nobody bothered me, and I came back in a couple of days," he recalled. He was living a life unburdened, despite his notorious past. His first trip to London was marked by a memorable stay at the White House Hotel, a fact that amused him endlessly. "Can you imagine Lucky Luciano sleeping at the White House?" he laughed, envisioning sending postcards to his mafia associates back in the US. He spent time with Lansky, explored potential new ventures, and indulged in London's luxuries, from high-end fabrics on Bond Street to custom-made ties from Sulca. Yet beyond the material pleasures, Luciano missed the simple things, the sounds, the language, the hum of a bustling English-speaking city. "Once you've been living in Italy, you miss everything about New York," he mused. The cold wind in London, the clatter of the streets, and watching English kids rush to school brought back a sense of nostalgia for the life he once knew. There were days I'd stand on the street corner in London, just letting the wind blow across my face, freezing and loving every minute of it. But perhaps what he missed most was the movies. In London, he could finally enjoy films in English, rather than the dubbed versions he endured in Italy. Just to sit in the damn movie house and listen to the original sound was worth the dough for the trip, he reflected. A small but significant pleasure for a man used to grand schemes. Luciano's time in Europe was a mix of business, indulgence, and nostalgia. While the world shifted around him and organized crime's role in global affairs deepened, he was, in many ways, just a man, savoring the simple things he had lost. Charlie "Lucky" Luciano had a fondness for England, spending significant time with gangsters and criminal syndicates in London. Always ahead of the curve, Luciano recognized that gambling would eventually be legalized in the UK, and he saw an opportunity to expand his empire. With his connections to the gambling operations in Las Vegas, New Orleans, New York, and Chicago, he knew his men could invest in London, a city that was increasingly positioning itself as a financial hub. London was hungry for investment to boost tourism, and Luciano saw this as a perfect opportunity to funnel money into the city's burgeoning industries. Offshore banking accounts were being set up, and the city, once at the helm of a global empire, was now struggling to maintain its influence as the post-war world order shifted. The UK, like many Western powers, was desperate to ward off the threat of communism and socialism, particularly in vulnerable former colonies. To this end, both Britain and America propped up governments, often supporting dictators and arming military regimes to ensure these countries remained aligned with their interests. Luciano and his syndicate, ever opportunistic, worked behind the scenes to manipulate the shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. They had the money, the power, and even political influence reaching as far as Washington. It is widely known that the mafia held sway over the very fabric of the American political system, including the White House at that time. It's crucial to remember that wealth, regardless of the family or status, often had dubious origins. This was true even for the Kennedys, whose fortune was built partly on questionable activities. As old empires crumbled, new ones rose, and countries around the world hungry for capital were willing to look the other way when it came to the mafia. As long as these crime families brought wealth and power, they were welcomed into the upper echelons of society. Luciano, with his charm and influence, infiltrated these circles with ease. Luciano's influence in Europe grew to such an extent that he became something of an attraction to journalists. They found him not as a notorious gangster, but as a man seeking peace and quiet, someone who wanted to leave the violent past behind. He gave interviews across Europe, one 1952, another 1953, and his final interview in 1959. He enjoyed speaking to newspapers and magazines based in London. A Sunday newspaper once sent a journalist to Milan and Naples to interview Luciano, expecting to meet a hardened criminal. Instead, they found a lovable fellow, as the headline famously described him. The interview was balanced, though it was clear the British journalist would hold Luciano accountable for his past mistakes. The journalist reviewed Luciano's history, his rise to power, his connections to prostitution and narcotics, and while Luciano denied involvement in the drug trade, the journalist remained skeptical. Despite Luciano's denials, the article stated that the journalist still believed he was a major player in the narcotics world. The following article you're about to hear is that very interview. In the private room of a café behind the colourful waterfront of Naples, I came face to face last week with a monster in rimless spectacles. At 57, Carmelo Salvatore Lucania, alias Charles Lucky Luciano, with his greying hair, slight build and modest manner, has the air of a retired elder statesman. He makes no claim to statesmanship, he dares not. As one of America's most notorious gangsters, deported back to his native Italy in 1946, he remains an elusive figure. It is this impudent claim of reform that I am now challenging. Despite his withdrawal from public life, he remains associated with crime. Luciano passionately claims that he has done nothing wrong, despite the millions of people in numerous countries to whom he has caused harm, Britain included. In my view, he is the wickedest man in the world. The narcotics traffic that he is deeply involved in is a worldwide menace. From New York to London, Paris to Rome, police forces are working together to try to overcome it. In America, federal agents are almost at their wits' end to stop the Niagara-like flow of drugs that is corrupting an entire generation of American youth. It is a menace that brings death and writhing agony to countless individuals across the West. For a long time, I have followed this ruthless trail of death. Every clue I found from Paris, London, New York, and Italy pointed to the same source: Luciano. It was in Italy that I began my investigation in earnest. The trail brought me right into the heart of Luciano's organization. I have untangled numerous complex threads that connect this ruthless killer and master criminal to the vilest drug traffickers at work today. My first meeting with Luciano made it clear that I was not dealing with a broken ex-convict, stripped of his evil powers. Some Italian police chiefs believe he is no longer a threat. They proudly point to the tight surveillance and restrictions under which Luciano lives. He is banned from all Italian cities except Naples, and a curfew keeps him in his home from 8 o'clock every night until 7 the following morning. At least once a week he must report to a designated police station. To ensure his compliance, a 24-hour watch by uniformed and plainclothes agents is maintained. The surveillance is so strict that Luciano told me he refuses to have a telephone installed in his home. He prefers not to have his calls tapped. Yet, despite these restrictions, Luciano continues to live a life of golden luxury. His apartment, in Naples' most exclusive block of flats overlooking the harbour, is sumptuous. He is one of Italy's biggest gamblers. His average bet at the races is £200 a day. He lavishes large sums of money and expensive gifts on his woman friend, Igea Lissoni, the dancer he met 6 years ago in a Rome nightclub. His entourage of hoodlums, gunmen and hangers-on costs as much as a minor royal court to maintain. As I waited for Luciano at the California bar, I watched his court assemble. Lucky was returning in state from the Agnano racetrack. 3 cars preceded his own. Out of them stepped 12 swaggering musclemen, each one with an extra bulge under his armpit. When Luciano descended alone from his car, the bodyguards swarmed around him. In a pack, they moved across the pavement into his private room. Before I was admitted into his presence, a gangster who called himself Luciano's secretary vetted me. Only then was I able to begin the first of 3 remarkable interviews. Despite his repeated refrain, "If I'm doing wrong, prove it," I was able to force Luciano to make a number of staggering admissions. First, he confessed that he regularly receives funds from 2 leading gangsters in America's infamous Crime Incorporated, which nearly monopolizes murder and extortion in the United States. These 2 men are none other than Frank Costello, the key figure in the Senate crime inquiry that shocked America, and Meyer Lansky, one of his lieutenants. "It's not a crime to get money," Luciano explained in his Brooklyn accent. "It's purely personal." But even more startling was his confession that he had been in touch with a half-dozen convicted dope traffickers, chiefly responsible for the worldwide drug scandal now under investigation by narcotics agents. I was able to extract this admission only because I had built a dossier on these Luciano contacts that Lucky himself could not refute. The first simple and horrifying fact in my dossier is that, in the past 4 years, 1 ton of heroin, the most vicious of all drugs, has been smuggled from Italy to America, where it was sold to addicts for an officially estimated sum of £178 million. This amount is only what the authorities have been able to trace. It is quite certain that a much larger quantity of heroin has entered both America and Britain from Italian sources. Smuggling operations have mainly been carried out by American gangsters of Italian origin, most of them former members of Luciano's American organization. Incredibly, they got their supplies from a number of Italian scientists who manufactured heroin in reputable chemical works. These concerns received raw materials from the Far and Middle East and held licenses to process the drug. The scientists diverted enough of the product from legitimate medical use to create a lucrative illicit trade in heroin. While my investigation into this startling development continues, the Italian police have caught one of these shameless men of science. He is Professor Carlo Migliardi, the former Director General of Schiaparelli Laboratories, now serving an 11-year sentence. Among those awaiting trial in a similar case are 3 men deported as gangsters from America. Luciano admitted to me that he had been in contact with 2 of them. Almost every person in Italy known to be, or suspected of being, involved in the illicit drug trade has had contact with Luciano. The trail between them is littered with corpses. One of those due to face trial in the upcoming case was Francesco Callace, a former member of a gang led by Luciano. His bullet-riddled body was found in a car in New York on November 14, 1954. Callace had made a statement about drug trafficking to the Italian police, which led them to 2 other suspects. Both of these men have since died of natural causes. Back in Sicily, the police wanted to interview Raymond Bentivegna, another known associate of Luciano who had returned to Sicily from New York. They could not find him. Then, his brother was seen wearing a black tie. When a senior police officer asked him whom he mourned, the brother replied, "I think Raymond has been killed. I don't know anything." Entirely innocent people have been caught up in the web of fear Luciano weaves around him. There is, for example, the case of Egidio Calascibetta, a scientist and socialite who bears the honorable Italian title of Commendatore. The Commendatore, an elderly gentleman who wears a 4-diamond ring on his right hand, was connected with the well-respected chemical firm Sace. To the horror of both Calascibetta and the firm, it was discovered that 60 pounds of heroin manufactured at the firm's factory under official license had been diverted to the black market. This was no small matter. At current black market prices, the missing heroin is worth nearly £5 million. Although the public procurator declared both Calascibetta and the firm blameless, I decided to interview him to see if he could shed light on the illicit drug trade. I called on him at his hotel in the seaside resort of Castiglioncello, where he was on holiday. But the drug trade was the last thing he wanted to discuss. When I mentioned Luciano's name, he mopped his brow, drew his right index finger across his throat, and whispered, "I am as good as dead if I talk to you. Please go away." That night, as I was leaving my hotel in Castiglioncello, I was arrested by a sergeant of the local carabinieri. I was taken to the police station and subjected to an intensive interrogation. Eventually, it was suggested that I would be wise to leave town. I did so the following day. But 2 weeks later, after pursuing my inquiries elsewhere, I returned to Castiglioncello and again interviewed the Commendatore. When I told him about my arrest, he admitted that it had occurred at his instigation. "I had you arrested," he said, "because I thought you were a Luciano gangster. I was afraid." Throughout our second interview, a police officer was present. The Commendatore's fear of Luciano, or anyone he suspected of being Luciano's emissary, was palpable. One thing is absolutely clear. Luciano inspires fear that borders on panic in the hearts of both guilty and innocent people all over Italy, even in towns hundreds of miles from his open prison in Naples. How does he maintain this hold? That, too, is a secret I have uncovered in my investigation into the world's wickedest man. Next week, I will tell you how he laid the foundations of his vicious career through murder and a fantastic stroke of luck. I know Lucky Luciano as one of the evilest criminals, mobster, thug, and dope peddler, whose hands were shaped by the nasty circumstances of an Italian youngster who fell on the sidewalks of New York. I interviewed him, and when he described his story, it was as naive as it was filled with contempt. He claimed to be misunderstood, saying, "I know the world today. He is a vicious criminal on an international scale." Yet, some police authorities believe he is just a victim bewildered, hungry, and poor among thieves. Lucky told me this himself, and he laughed as he recounted how he had fooled the authorities in Naples. When he was deported to Italy, after serving 10 years of a 30-year sentence in the United States, his FBI dossier followed him. I have seen it, and know it is an ugly document. "The cops gave me the once-over when I got to Italy," Lucky told me. "They asked me all about that file that followed me. I had to tell them some sort of fairy story," he said. "I told them I was just a kid, a poor little Italian boy who didn't know his way around New York. I said I had lost my people, I was hungry, and I didn't know what I was carrying when I ran errands." Carmelo Salvatore Lucania. His real name waved his arm with supreme scorn. "They swallowed the lot," he grinned. Luciano may think they bought his story, but the restrictions placed on him show they have not been fooled. Lucky Luciano was one of the smartest drug operators when he was just 18 years old on New York's East Side. Within a few years, he became the boss of the Mafia, the dreaded secret society from his native Sicily, a gang of cutthroats who spun a sinister web of murder and extortion throughout America. That is the real Lucky Luciano. It is true that he ran errands as a youngster, but it is a lie that he didn't know what he was carrying. He was, of course, running dope. Luciano was about 15 when he started, an unkempt youth with a mop of unruly hair, a gravelly voice, and worn, ill-fitting second-hand clothes. By the time he was 19, he was sentenced to jail for a year for drug trafficking. He served 6 months, and those 6 months were just enough to give a vicious edge to his criminal education. As a native son of Sicily, Luciano was marked down for membership in the Mafia, which controlled the vast Italian element in America. Protection money was its biggest income, but smuggling and selling narcotics was a lucrative sideline. Although it has never been proven that Luciano committed murder, a typical qualification for Mafia membership, he became a full member. He cut his wrist and let his blood mingle with that of other members at the sordid initiation ceremony. Swiftly, Luciano rose to become one of the inner circles. They called him Salvatore of 14th Street, or Salvatore, the Silent One. Soon, Luciano learned that the seats near the top could be very warm. One night, while standing on a street corner waiting for a girl, a car pulled up. 3 gunmen bundled him into the car and drove him through the streets of New York. They threw him to the floor of the car and began beating him mercilessly, not just with their fists, but with their feet. They pressed their point home by stubbing out cigarettes on his face. Luciano passed out. When Luciano woke, he found himself on the sands of Staten Island. His face was pulped and unrecognizable. When the police arrived, they had trouble identifying the usually smooth, suave crook. His chin was split by a hideous gash, his eyes swollen shut, and his face disfigured by purple bruises. Instead of calling a taxi, the police called an ambulance. The news of Luciano's beating quickly spread through the underworld. At first, people laughed. Imagine the second-in-command of the Mafia being taken for a ride. But when they heard that Luciano had survived, they were amazed. "He's Charlie Lucky," they exclaimed. The nickname stuck. However, it wasn't luck that rocketed Luciano to the top of New York's sprawling underworld. It was cold, calculated cunning. His first major move came when the leadership of the Mafia became vacant. Luciano backed Joe Masseria, a notorious gunman with a string of killings to his name. Luciano made sure all other candidates were removed. Salvatore Mauro was shot in the street. Umberto Valenti was mown down just a few doors from a police station. Luciano was at Masseria's side during all these killings. It was 1920, and prohibition had just been introduced. Luciano organized hundreds of illicit distilleries and breweries. He supplied them with yeast, barley, and sugar. To handle the distribution of this ocean of bootleg hooch, he linked up with the infamous Diamond brothers, Jack "Legs" Diamond and his brother, Eddie. Luciano boasts of this, claiming it as his defense. "That's where I made my money," he told me, with an expansive wave of his arm. "I made it in bootlegging and gambling." But when it came to drugs, Luciano claimed, "I never touched no dope." Once again, I say he is a liar. Even while working as personal assistant to the mafia boss and bootlegging with the Diamond Gang, he was running his own drug business. In 1923, he was arrested for delivering morphine to a federal undercover agent. More drugs were found in his home, but he got away scot-free. The price of his liberty was the information he gave about other dope peddlers outside the mafia. Luciano squealed on them, and as a result, federal agents uncovered nearly £250,000 worth of drugs. That wasn't the only charge he evaded. His FBI criminal record, which I've seen, shows he was arrested for various offences, ranging from illegal possession of firearms to petty offences such as driving without a licence. Yet, he was never charged. This immunity may have led to the brutal beating he received in New York. Luciano claims that it was the police who beat him up. "But they were afraid to kill me," he said. Why did they attack him? Luciano says it was to settle a personal grudge, a grudge that couldn't be aired in court. The Italian police questioned him about the kidnapping, but of course he told them a different story. He claimed that Frank Costello, now a powerful figure in the American underworld, but then a comparatively minor figure, was responsible. It was like saying a schoolboy boxing champion had knocked out Rocky Marciano. Luciano shrugged. "I had to tell them some stuff, didn't I?" he said almost plaintively. Turning a blind eye to Luciano's activities was the greatest mistake some American authorities ever made. Soon, Luciano was wielding power not only over the police, but also over politicians and even statesmen. Crime cartel. So insidious was Luciano's influence and power that, at one time, he was receiving extortion money from nearly every loaf of bread sold in New York. After being held on suspicion of the murder of Arnold Rothstein, one of America's most notorious criminals, Luciano decided to streamline the underworld as a form of self-protection. He formed the Big Seven to put an end to the bootlegging wars outside Chicago, gang wars that drew too much police attention to his activities. The Big Seven took over the Atlantic seaboard and controlled all rum running into America from the Atlantic. In other words, they owned America's bootlegging industry. Luciano had formed the first cartel in crime. 5 bullets ripped into the body of an elderly man seated at a card table in New York. The scars of 15 more pitted the wall behind him. Joe Masseria, boss of the Mafia, a notorious gang of Sicilian thugs in America, was dead. And Lucky Luciano, who had been playing cards with the boss just a few minutes earlier, was now in control of this vast, evil band of men whose sinister influence was gnawing into nearly every branch of American life. The date? April 1931. Over 24 years ago. But the murder of Masseria is more than just a sordid excerpt from the history of American gang warfare. Lucky Luciano has never loosened his grip on the American underworld. I can reveal that he is an even greater power today than he was that April evening. Though he has been deported to his native Italy, though he is under city arrest in Naples, though he must be in his luxurious home by 8 o'clock each evening, he is still the boss. His tentacles spread as far as the Middle East and across the Atlantic. His major activity centers on the foul international traffic of dope. That much is clear from the dossier I have compiled from my trip to Italy and from interviews with Luciano himself and his associates. That is why I brand him the wickedest man in the world. He has held this unenviable title for a long time, ever since that April evening 24 years ago. It was supposed to be a pleasant evening. Luciano had invited Masseria to dinner, and the card game had begun as the other customers were leaving the restaurant. With strange old-world politeness, Lucky excused himself and went to wash his hands. Later, underworld cynics would say he had gone off to do a Pontius Pilate. Masseria was dead when Luciano returned, and when he came back, the new boss raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. His only comment was, "I heard the shooting, so I came out to see what it was all about." Even hardened gangsters were shocked by the murder of Masseria, but the bloodbath was just beginning. The slaying of the boss triggered a ghastly sequence of murders that spread from coast to coast. It was the first of 35 murders, a mass execution planned with lightning speed and carried out within 48 hours. Each victim was an old guard mafia man thought to have been linked with Masseria. But it wasn't just a lust for personal power that brought Luciano to the top. He and Masseria had differed on basic policy. Masseria, a Sicilian, still believed in the law of the knife and the gun, and in death to all who stood in his way. Luciano, on the other hand, believed in organization. "Chicago gang war stuff don't do no one any good," he said. "We've got to get together around a table and settle our differences. We've got to run crime on sound commercial lines." The massacre of September 11th put an end to the mafia in America. It was replaced by Unione Siciliana, a new organization created by Luciano. The mafia's business had been extortion, murder, and the peddling of narcotics. The new union took over its bloodstained assets. Believe me, it still holds them. And Lucky is still chairman of this sinister corporation of crime. It didn't take him long to expand its interests. He began squeezing extortion money from large labor and industrial groups. He expanded his influence from coast to coast across the United States. The first to go was Salvatore Maranzano, an old guard mafia man who didn't approve of Luciano's rise to power. Lucky smelled mutiny. Maranzano died on the night of September 11th, 1931. It was the first of 35 murders, a mass execution planned with lightning speed and carried out within 48 hours. Each victim was an old guard mafia man thought to have been loyal to Maranzano. But Luciano didn't stop there. He knew the first step toward greater power was getting a foothold in local politics. It is through these local district parties that candidates for the Senate and Congress are sponsored. In one of these elections, Lucky sponsored a small-time Democrat from New York's East Side, Albert C. Manella. Luciano nominated him against a man named Harry Perry. Perry never said why he suddenly stood down from that election, but it is no secret that one morning 2 of Luciano's gangsters walked into his office, laid 2 guns on his desk and said, "You've got a wife and kids, haven't you? You wouldn't want to see them in the river, would you?" That was just the beginning. Luciano began making his way up the political ladder. When I interviewed him in Naples, he boasted openly about his rise in one of the ugliest displays of arrogance I have ever witnessed. He even went so far as to suggest that aides of President Roosevelt had tried to buy his support and pinned a false charge of white slaving on him when he refused. It was this charge that earned him a 30-year prison sentence, of which he served 10 before being deported. "I'll tell you what happened," he said. "Al Smith and Roosevelt were competing for the nomination for the 1932 presidential election. They were both Democrats, but in New York, we hadn't made up our minds about which one to support. So Roosevelt's men came to me and offered me a stack of money to sway the Italian vote his way. But I'm not that kind of guy. I told them I didn't do things like that. Because of that, when they got on top, they framed me up and sent me up the river." When the Democratic Party gained more power in America, Luciano began using his political influence. He was able to decide who would be district attorney, the very person responsible for fighting crime. He could even influence local authorities about who should become judges, prosecutors, and state legislators. The repeal of prohibition did nothing to diminish the power of the czar of crime. Like the other gang bosses, Luciano jumped right into the gambling rackets. The mob's operations were nearly as large as the state itself. And once again, it was Luciano who ensured the state would not interfere. Johnny Torrio, the gang boss of Chicago and Al Capone's successor, called a meeting of his fellow thugs. "While we're divided among ourselves, while we have gang wars and killings," he said, "we lay ourselves open to be taken down by the law. But if we're united, we'll be bigger than the law itself." It took time to instill this idea of collective security into the heads of some of the gang bosses. Luciano, along with his pal Louis Lepke Buchalter, orchestrated the meeting. Word was sent around the country, and at a second meeting, big bosses from all the formidable gangs of America were present. "We've got to have rules," they said. "We've got to abide by a majority vote." They decided that there would be no killings unless Crime Incorporated of the United States agreed to them. The Syndicate not only planned how to defeat the law, but in some cases, how the law would be made. For example, they discussed the assassination of Tom Dewey, an up-and-coming attorney who was considered too dangerous. "That's bad policy," said Luciano. "If we hit him, we hit ourselves. Let him live." The Syndicate agreed that Dewey would not be killed. But Dutch Schultz, one of the Syndicate's leading members, had other ideas. Dewey had almost nailed Schultz on income tax evasion, and Schultz made plans to have him assassinated. One of Schultz's own men tipped off the Syndicate. Schultz and his 2 bodyguards were shot in the Palace Chop House on the night of October 23, 1935. I never thought I would write a single word in favor of Lucky Luciano, the international gangster whom I have branded as the wickedest man in the world. Yet my investigations have shown that there is a streak of decency in the makeup of this monster. It showed briefly during the war when danger threatened America. Luciano actually helped the Allied war effort from his prison cell. That, in fact, is why he is not in jail today. When he was sentenced to 30 years for organizing prostitution, his associates thought he would never know freedom again. But the authorities relented. In recognition of his wartime help, they released him after he had served 10 years and deported him to Italy. Even in Sing Sing, even when he was allowed to write only 2 letters a week, this fantastic crook retained his power over America's sprawling underworld. The police knew this, but there was little they could do about it. But when a wave of espionage and sabotage swept along the East Coast ports, particularly New York's waterfront, they were glad he still had influence. The United States Naval Intelligence Department approached him through his lawyer. "You're still the boss, whose word is law," they said. "What about helping us with the war effort?" No promises were made, but Luciano agreed to help. Some of his gang members were brought into jail to see him. He told them, "Go out and clean up this thing, get the boys working, and tell them I said so." The gangs who controlled the waterfronts of America got to work. Within weeks, sabotage and espionage ceased. When plans were being laid for the invasion of Sicily, the intelligence experts visited Sing Sing again. They asked Luciano for help because they knew he still controlled the notorious Unione Siciliana, and that its influence extended not only throughout America, but also to Italy and Sicily. From his cell, Lucky used his influence to help ensure that opposition from Italians and Sicilians was minimal when Allied troops landed. Now, let me be clear. I am not whitewashing this man. Not only is he still associated with a wicked gang of international drug smugglers, but he has also made a fortune from another foul trade vice. He sunk his claws deep into this mire when the Great Depression hit America, and the profits from his other sordid rackets, gambling, extortion, and protection, began to dwindle. He sent for the 4 hoodlums who controlled the New York brothels and bluntly told them, "You guys are through. From now on, you're working for me." He immediately reorganized the 4 groups into one big combine. At one point, he controlled 200 brothels in New York City alone. Girls of all ages from across America were pulled into this network. If a house of vice were not providing enough money, his enforcers would wreck it, beating up the inmates. By 1935, less than 3 years after taking over, it was estimated that the gross income from these sources was around £41 million a year. Of this, the Syndicate took £1,250,000, while Luciano's net personal profit was about £30,000. Then New York's young district attorney, Thomas E. Dewey, stepped in. He quickly discovered that vice and prostitution were as well protected as the other rackets. Nobody would talk. "I know what the Combine does," said one prostitute questioned by the police. "Girls who talk have their feet and stomachs burned with cigarettes. Their tongues are cut out." Dewey found a solution. On the evening of February the 1st, 1936, plainclothes men attached to Dewey's department reported for special duty. They swooped on 41 brothels, arresting all the women found on the premises and taking them to Dewey's headquarters. For 5 days, the prisoners were questioned. But not a single scrap of evidence was collected that could involve Luciano. Dewey had almost given up hope of nailing him when a man named Dave Miller confessed. Miller had been a policeman in Pittsburgh before becoming involved in the vice trade. However, it wasn't an uneasy conscience that led him to confess. When he was arrested, his wife and 3 children were taken into custody too. He bought their freedom with the information he provided. It took weeks of cajoling, pleading, and skillful cross-examination to drag the necessary corroborative evidence from the women in the business. A squad of armed guards surrounded the local jail in Hot Springs, where Luciano was held after his arrest. He was charged with 90 counts of extortion and directing organized prostitution. His bail was set at nearly £100,000. 68 witnesses testified that he was the head of the vice ring. "My business is gambling houses and booking horses," Luciano said from the witness stand. "They framed me because of politics," he told me when I interviewed him in Naples. But then he convicted himself from his own lips. "I gave money to prostitutes," he said. "I never took it from them. The only people I ever took money from were the men who controlled them." On Saturday, June 6th, the jury retired to consider their verdict on 62 individual charges against Lucky and 13 others in the dock with him. They returned the following morning. 62 times the foreman of the jury uttered the word "guilty" as each charge against Luciano was read. Then he repeated the performance for all the others involved. The judge ordered the defendants back for 11 days while he considered the penalties. Before doing so, he read the probation officer's report on Luciano, which included the passage, "His ideals of life are resolved into money to spend, beautiful women to enjoy, silk underclothes, and places to go in style." The judge said to Luciano, "You are responsible for every foul and cruel deed, accompanied by extortion, carried out by your band." He sentenced Luciano to a minimum of 30 years in the state penitentiary, provided he demonstrated good behavior, with a maximum of 50 years if warranted. No one could recall such a severe sentence. It sent the mogul mobster reeling back as he stood before the judge. The others standing with him blanched as sentences of 25 years, 40 years, and 15 years were doled out. Now, Luciano is free, living a life of luxury in Naples. He is still not only the wickedest man in the world, but also one of the most diabolically dangerous. Italy is the clearing ground for all the dope that comes from the Middle East, and lucky Luciano is the man who will ensure this dreadful cargo finds its way to America and to Britain.